Hey all, hello and welcome, Tony Bing here. For this guide video we will have a look at the Infinity system. Now this particular system in Marvel Heroes Omega is unlocked once you reach level 60 on your first hero, and from that point onwards any XP you gain will go towards the Infinity System XP pool, and that's actually shared between all characters. So for example, if you've hit level 60, you've unlocked the Infinity System, and let's say you have 20 Infinity points. If you then want to start a new hero from level 1, you actually have those 20 Infinity points unlocked and ready to use straight away. So they're not shared between heroes. Each hero gets use of the total number of Infinity points that you've actually gained. Now within the Infinity system there are 6 different gems that have various different effects that you can put your points into, and due to the nature of the Infinity system being infinite, which won't be a surprise, what I'll be doing for this video is actually going through each of the gems, discussing the various nodes, and I'll talk about the priority that I would recommend putting the points into. The reason we concentrate on priority is in time, if you play long enough, you will be able to complete all the nodes with the exception of the attribute nodes that are infinite, and you can continue to put points into them. So the first gem we'll look at here will be the power gem. So as we go through these particular nodes, there will be some slight variance on what order you would unlock them in depending on your particular hero, but this still can be used as a rough guide, with some of the worst nodes, of which there are some that aren't great, that will be at the bottom of the list and the better ones being at the top. But on the subject of the better ones, the first one we look at here is Superhuman. So this offers you 0.1% brutal strike chance. Now if you were to max this out, it would cost you 150 Infinity points, and that would actually give you a flat 5% brutal strike chance, which is pretty great, because as you start to get a higher brutal strike chance, it's subject to diminishing returns, so a flat amount works fantastic. We then have Strike Through, and this would offer you a 1% brutal damage rating, costs 150 points in total, and that would offer 75% brutal damage. This is something that I would recommend using once you've got a high crit and brute. There's no point putting points into brutal damage if you're not bruting very often. Now next up, if Strength was actually your attribute, I would recommend putting points into Strength, and that would actually cost 25 points per attribute. We then have the Power Gem Infusion, and the way these work is the more of a particular attribute you have, so the higher strength you would have, it would allow you to stack this higher, so you've got the 5% chance to deal additional damage, and this is something that you want to use once you've got high attributes. There's no point using it if you've only got, let's say, 5 or 10 strength attribute, but once you start to stack it higher, then start to put your points into this. Now the final one we look at, and one I wouldn't really recommend, is Show of Mercy. So this is 0.5% base damage against weakened enemies. So in total it costs 150 points, and it would provide 25% base damage. Now it's situational, the enemy has to be weakened, and if we actually add it up, it would actually cost you 24 points for 4% base damage against weakened enemies. Whereas if Strength was your primary attribute, that would offer you 4% base damage, and that would actually cost you only 1 extra Infinity point, and you would also get the deflect rating multiplier in there as well. So I really wouldn't recommend using Show of Force for that reason. Next up, we look at the mastery of this particular gem, and the way this works is when you put points into a gem, you unlock benefits, and it currently caps out at 150, which actually works out perfect for Superhuman. Superhuman, if you want the 5% brutal strike chance, would cost you 150 points. That's what I would recommend using this for. Now the benefits you gain are actually pretty great. Your ultimate gains a 20% critical hit chance at 50 points. At 100 points, your signature has a 10% brutal strike chance, and it also weakens the enemy for 10 seconds. And then finally, this is the same across all gems. For 150 points spent in any particular gem, you will gain +1 to all attributes. So that's really pretty nice there. But next up, let's have a look at the Reality Gem. Now this next gem here actually really isn't particularly great at all. So the first option I would recommend unlocking would be Potency, and with that it's a 0.5% base damage to signature powers. That would cost a total of 200 points, and that would provide you with 100% base signature damage. Now do note it's base and not flat damage, so you won't see a huge increase on your signature. This is potentially worthwhile in some characters that can get their signature down low, for example, I think maybe Wolverine or Hawkeye, but I really wouldn't recommend putting your points into this if you're on a hero that has a signature of about 30 seconds plus. Now next up, if it was your primary attribute, I would most definitely recommend then putting points into the energy attribute, and that's 25 points per one attribute you gain. You then have the power gem infusion that I'd recommend putting points into next, so that will give you the 5% chance to deal energy damage, and this scales based on your energy attribute. We then have turn the tides and power overwhelm, and these two I really can't recommend, and that's why they're actually below power gem infusion. You won't see many options that are like that in this video. Now with turn the tides, that provides 3% base damage and 3% base health when you use your ultimate, and that would last for 20 seconds. If you were to max this out, it would cost 150 points, and that would provide you with 150% base damage and health. But do bear in mind your ultimate power has a cooldown of 10 minutes, and this skill would only have an uptime of 20 seconds during that 10 minutes there, so I really can't recommend that. The next one we look at is power overwhelming, so it's 0.1% ultimate power cooldown. If you were to max this out, it would cost a whopping 400 points, and for that you would only gain a 10% ultimate cooldown reduction, so your 400 points can be much better spent in other nodes. Now if we look at the mastery, this is a bit underwhelming as well for this particular gem. The other gems are great, so don't get disheartened if you're watching this. Now the mastery here, for spending 50 points, when you use your med kit you reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 3 seconds, but that has a 30-second cooldown on it. If you spend 100 points, when you use your signature you reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 6 seconds, and that's got a 60-second cooldown. And then of course for 150 points you get the +1 to all attributes. So unless your primary attribute is energy and your secondary attribute really isn't that useful, I would not recommend putting any points into this particular gem at all. Maybe at most put in 6 into energy, and that would cost you 150 points, which would give you all the bonuses, which through time they will make a slight difference to the cooldown of your ultimate, but there's certainly much better options out there. Now the next gem we'll look at is a much better one, and this is the soul gem. The first node we look at in this gem is against all the odds, and this is a great one. With this it's 0.2% base health regen per second. If you were to max this out it would cost a whopping 350 points, but you don't really need to max it. I find putting roughly 100-150 points in it can make a difference, but if you did max it that would give you a total of 10% base regen per second. The actual attribute in this particular gem is fighting. Fighting's fantastic because it has the crit rate and multiplier bonus. Now if you're unsure about attributes, I will be doing a video in the next day or so that actually discusses them, so keep an eye out for that anyway. But I would recommend fighting as the second one you go for the fact that it has a crit rating as mentioned. Next up we would have inner resilience, so this is 0.2% base health regen on hit. So it would cost a total of 300 points to max out for 10% base life on hit. Now you may be asking why this is further down the list than the first option we looked at, which was against all the odds. Now the benefit of against all the odds is the fact that it is a flat health regen per second. You don't have to be in combat, so if you're about to go down you can run round the corner, do the cowardly thing which you sometimes have to do, and regen your health. Whereas with inner resilience you have to stay in combat, and genuinely if you need the health regen it's because you're in a dangerous situation, so you want to actually be out of combat. So for that reason I do believe it's spending a little bit more on the points is worthwhile and going for against all the odds first. The next node I would recommend selecting in this gem would be the soul gem infusion, so your 5% chance to deal mental damage, again scaling on how much fighting you actually have. Now the final option, bottom of the list, we have strike through. So this is 0.5% to healing received. It would cost 200 points, in total it provides you with 25% to healing received. I can't really recommend it. I don't believe it's one that's massively needed. If you were possibly playing on a hero, off the top of my head I'm thinking if you're playing on a hero such as maybe Blade, who can have huge life on hit if you build him the right way, this might be worth using, and it's something I need to look into. But offhand the other options above it are they're superior without having to look into them. The fact I have to look into this one says to me that it's not as good as the other options available. For the mastery in this particular gem, if we spend 50 points, we have a great little option, which is when you fall below 30% max health, you trigger your med kit without actually activating the cooldown on it, and that's got a 60-second cooldown. That's pretty great. For 100 points, you have increased healing from your med kit by 10%. Not fantastic, but it would come in helpful, especially with your med kit activating when you fall below the 30% health. And then finishing up, you have the 150 points, which gives you +1 to all attributes there. So I would recommend putting points into against all the odds to get to the stage where you've spent 150, because these 3 mastery options are worth unlocking. But next up, we will have a look at the space gem. First node we look at in the space gem is actually a fantastic one, and it's one that I'll normally go for potentially first when I unlock anything. This is Gravity Well, so it's 1% base health, and that is 500 points if you were to put everything in it and max it out, but that would provide you with a whopping 250% base health. So with this, you're not going to use your first 500 points on it because it won't be needed. So what I would recommend doing if you're playing content, you find you're getting downed, simply just start to put more points into it and find a point where your health pool is large enough for you to beat the current content that you are playing. Next up, when you had health at a reasonable level, I would recommend putting points into micro warps. So this is 0.5% total defense rating. It would cost you 150 points in total, and that would offer 75% total defense rating. Now, only use this if defense is one of your primary defensive attributes. I wouldn't use it if you maybe had, let's say, deflect and dodge. It wouldn't be worthwhile using that. Now, on the subject of deflect and dodge, the next one we look at is spatial substitution. So this says 0.1% deflect chance. It would cost you 200 points in total, and that would offer you a 5% flat deflect chance. Now, something I'll mention here is we actually have a node that we'll look at later on that offers the similar version of this, but in the dodge variety. It costs the same amount of points and offers the same amount of dodge. Now, with deflect, what happens is you take half damage from an attack if you deflect it, and you deflect the other half back on the enemy. But with dodge, you don't take any damage. Now, for that reason, if your setup is such that you gain a bonus from the deflect and dodge defensive stats, I would recommend going for dodge over deflect, because it's essentially twice as effective. Now, next up here, I would recommend putting points into the attribute, and that would be durability. And finishing up, we have the soul gem infusion here, so the 5% chance, and you would actually deal physical damage with this. And bear in mind, only do put your points into this once you've got durability to a high enough level. For the mastery, we have options that potentially look a bit underwhelming, but they're actually really quite good. The first one, for 50 points spent, your medkit causes you to take 10% less damage for 5 seconds. And we can actually, through various different options, lower the cooldown on our medkit, so you can have that 10% less damage up really quite often. For 100 points, we increase damage reduction by 1%, which looks terrible. However, this actual 1% damage reduction is taken off after all your other damage reduction. So it's taken off after your weaken, your defense, your deflect, for example. Then that flat 1% comes off, so it's really not as bad as it seems at first. 150 points is your +1 to all attributes there. But next gem we'll look at will be the time gem. The time gem is another great one, and it's one of those ones where the primary option on it is one that I would recommend taking very early. Now, the primary option is temporal loophole. So with this, it's a 0.5% attack and movement speed buff. It would cost you 200 points in total, but that would give you a huge 25% attack and movement speed increase. Now, the movement speed increase actually really does make quite a big difference, so I would highly recommend this. Next up, we have one we've already touched on already in the last gem, and this is Chrono Shift. So it's a 0.1% dodge chance, 200 points, and you can see it's a 5% dodge chance. So as you can see, I mentioned earlier, if you've got both deflect and dodge as your multipliers, you want to go for dodge here because it's the same cost. We would then put points into the attribute speed. Now the reason I really like this is it adds a modifier to your dodge rating. So if you're a character that already has a dodge rating multiplier and actually has speed as one of their primary attributes, you can get your dodge rating up to a huge amount, the multiplier on it. I've seen on certain heroes, I think it's Nova and Storm, I've seen in the region around about 40-50% dodge rating multiplier, and it really does make the characters pretty godly from a defense perspective. Next up, once you had your speed at a relatively high level, you could put points into Soul Gem Infusion for your 5% chance to deal physical damage. Finishing up, can't really recommend this one much, it's Time Flux. So this is a 0.5% dash teleport cooldown. It would cost a huge 300 points for a 30% reduction. Now the reason I can't really recommend this is you will want to use Temporal Loophole on your characters, and it costs 200 points, which would in turn mean that the mastery bonuses we look at are already unlocked. Now these mastery bonuses make Time Flux not really necessary to have. So for 50 points, when you use your medkit, your dash powers gain a charge. For 100 points, your dash powers have one additional charge there. So for that reason, I think Time Flux isn't needed. Put your points into Temporal Loophole instead. And finishing up, you know this one by now, 150 points gives you the +1 to all attributes. But the final gem we'll look at will be the Mind Gem. For the Mind Gem, we start off by looking at the Deep Thought node. Now this is a great one. It can actually help out heroes who have spirit issues and a lot of heroes who have unique resources. You can come across certain powerful builds once you hit a certain threshold on the resource, and this allows you to get that. Each particular point in it would give you 5 spirit, and that would cost in total 200 points to max out, which would in turn give you a huge 500 spirit. And there are quite a lot of heroes that I play that need that in order for their build to work. For example, Iron Fist and Star-Lord are 2 builds that I have myself that I need that extra spirit, so this is a great node. Don't underestimate this one at all. Now next up we have Mind Over Matter, which is 0.1% critical hit chance, 200 points in total to max, which would give you a huge 5% critical hit chance. And as mentioned when we discussed the Brutal Strike chance, it's a flat chance, it's not affected by diminishing returns. So once you get into the region of, let's say, 50 or even 60% critical hit, this will bump it way up. Whereas if you were to get the stats that would be worth the equivalent of 5% at lower levels, you'd maybe only see a gain of about 0.5%. So this really is great. The next one we have would be the Tribute Intelligence. The reason I rate this so highly is it also offers a crit damage rating bonus as well, which is really great. It's only the one of 2 attributes that do offer an offensive option. That would be Fighting with the crit rating multiplier and Intelligence with the crit damage rating, so this is really good. We then have Mental Focus at 0.2% critical damage, 150 points to max, and that would give you 30% critical damage, so that can be pretty nice. However, I would only recommend putting your points into it if you had a high crit rating. Now the final one we look at is Soul Gem Infusion, your 5% chance to deal mental damage. So as always, make sure you've stacked your primary attribute Intelligence first before you put any points into that. For the Mastery, we've actually got some pretty good options here as well. For 50 points, when you critically hit, you regenerate 0.5% of your maximum health, so that's not your base health but your maximum, so that's really quite nice. For 100 points you increase your cost reduction by 10%, and similar to the Deep Thought node, this particular option can actually open up some build options on heroes, so it's really worth putting the points in to get this. Final one is of course the +1 to all attributes for 150 points spent. So that is all the 6 gems covered. I hope this particular video was useful. It is a bit of a minefield infinity system and it took me a while to get my head around it as well, but again, hopefully this was useful. Happy hunting with your infinity points, and I will see you all again soon enough.